Hello everyone, and welcome back to the main stage where right now we are talking all about identity in the Nordics and beyond. Now, of course, the Nordics and Scandinavian states have had great success in terms of identity schemes. So I'm really delighted to have two panelists here today who are going to be able to tell us all about this regional approach. So welcome, first of all, to Christopher Hennes, former Chief Digital Officer at S-Banken in Norway. Hi, Christopher. And welcome to Krista Kurlin, Head of Digital and Mobile Banking at OP Financial Group in Finland. Hi, Krista.
Hello. Hello.
Hi. But what is very exciting about this panel is that we're actually bringing you a really global perspective and discussion on identity today. So we want to get to the bottom of how the Nordic model compares to the rest of the world and how different cultures and different environments are impacting progress on identity. So I'm excited as well to be joined by Melissa Heng, Senior Director of Identity Product Management at Capital One in the United States. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, how are you?
Good, and how are you?
Good.
Great, thank you for joining us. And finally, we're welcoming as well Jonathan Williams, Principal Consultant at MK2 Consulting. And Jonathan's going to be able to give us a wider perspective on identity, looking at regions across Europe and Asia as well. So welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks, Laura.
So with that, I think we should get started. And as this is FinTech Talents Nordics, what better place to start than with the Nordics region? So I'll direct my first question at Krista. And with a range of national identity schemes, the Nordics often is held up as quite a progressive environment for identity. But what, from your perspective, are some of the really unique aspects and challenges that you're seeing in the region?
Thank you, Laura. I think traditionally in the Nordics, we have had a very high trust amongst the society. So not only citizens trust the authorities, but authorities trust the citizens, and banks obviously are a key player in this equation. And banks have taken a fairly central role, at least here in Finland, but also in some other Nordic countries, in being the mediator between some of the authorities that need the kind of digital identity and the customers of all banks. So not just their own customers, but also customers of other banks. So we have things like Bank ID, which can be used as a full-on strong authenticated digital identity. So I think that's one thing. I think another thing is that in all the Nordic countries, the technical infrastructure is quite strong. All the countries have really invested in technology in terms of broadband access and 5G networks. The smartphone penetration is very high, so the usage of digital identities is high. So that's probably another aspect. And then probably the third aspect is that I would say, I don't know, maybe this is boasting, but I think in general, I think in the Nordics, people are fairly curious about technology in general, and they're willing to try, using digital services that need identification, whether it's healthcare or banking or claiming taxes or you name it. So I think those three things at least are some of the unique aspects that the Nordics have.
Great. And Christopher, would that sort of be your experience as well? What, from your perspective, are some of the unique aspects and some of the unique challenges as well, maybe in the region?
I can say that I can confirm everything that Krista is saying. I have the statistics somewhere on my computer. It's close to 100% broadband internet connectivity in Norway. I think it's some 80% of penetration in smartphones. And also a lot of surveys can prove the fact that in the Nordics, consumers are early adopters. But the main ingredient is the trust factor. You mentioned it briefly. The bank ID, which is a common infrastructure, a common solution between the banks. And I think the trust between the banks, it's the really magic touch when it comes to digital identity in the Nordics, where I, as head of IT in one bank, can trust that my competitor has done their job in identifying the customers rightfully, that their digital identity certificate when they log into my bank is a valid certificate. And that's also why the digital identity schemes or solutions that are issued by the banks are also widely adopted outside of banking, accessing your tax information, accessing governmental services, accessing health records, and so forth. So it's still called Bank ID, but it's an identity solution which is used way beyond banking. But like with all things, it needs to be constantly developing with the times. What was a secure identity solution 10 years ago is not necessarily a secure solution next 10 years. So there's a constant evolution in digital identity solutions, even in the countries that are far ahead. We probably thought username and password was a good enough solution sometime as well. I wouldn't use that to log into my bank if it was up to me.
So overall then, would you say that the involvement of the banks with the national identity schemes has been one of the reasons for their high levels of success, do you think, Christopher?
Well, it's made by the banks. The banks they have been in the driver's seat all along, spearheading the development, and the public sector has adopted the identity solutions which are developed by the banks in cooperation, and the cooperation part is extremely important. We have a saying in the industry here in Norway that we collaborate when we can and compete when we must. And that mantra has been with the industry for several years and has laid the foundation for the digital infrastructure, not only the infrastructure in terms of connectivity, broadband, and so forth, but also the infrastructure between the banks and also the infrastructure in the public sector, the ability to access public records through real-time APIs. It's an important factor in making all of this work. Giving the opportunity for digital-only banks like S-Banken, where I recently left, to build on top of state-of-the-art building blocks which are shared among competitors, leaving behind everything that's something that this should only work. This is not something that we should compete on. Let us pool our resources and make the best possible foundation for each other. And that's probably why, if you look at the look at the numbers, look at the cost-income ratios of Norwegian banks compared to other European banks, you see that the spending is a lot lower. And of course, not all of that accounts to that infrastructure, but a lot of it accounts to that every single bank do not have to do everything by themselves.
Yeah, of course. And would you agree, Krista? Do you think that that's really the reason that national schemes have been so successful in the region? The involvement of the banks?
Of course, banks have been definitely a key driver to that, just like Christopher said, and definitely agree on on the fact that it probably also has to do with the fact that many of the Nordic countries are fairly small markets. So competing against one another in this kind of area would be just silly. It's much more much more logical to cooperate. But I also think that there's something that that goes a bit beyond that kind of banks collaborating with banks. It's also the society as a whole, and the fact that banks have in small countries, you have good relations with the regulators, with the authorities, and and that kind of forums already are in place, so it's much easier to start that collaboration. I think another thing that I have to mention what Christopher said about the APIs. I think one of the beauties that that the schemes have produced is not just providing the digital front end, so not just being able to claim your taxes from a digital UI with the bank ID, but actually pulling the data from different databases to the APIs of the tax authorities, providing me as a taxpayer a pre-filled tax claim, basically. And on the sort of best case scenario, all I have to do is click accept. So not just kind of providing means for me to log in, but also using the APIs and working on the back end so that the digitalization of the sharing of information on the background happens. And I think those kind of things are only possible if there is a high level of trust between the different actors. So again, we come to the trust point. And maybe just one more comment about banks. I think obviously banks, trust is a key element that we work on, but we're also experts on risk assessment. And that risk assessment ability is obviously something that creates trust amongst the other authorities, such as, say, border control or police force or things like that.
Absolutely. So it's easy to see from everything you're saying why this is held up as such a progressive model for identity, but taking it to a global perspective, do we think that this Nordic model can be exported? Perhaps, Jonathan, if I direct this question to you, do you think that that's something that could be exported to the rest of the world or to other regions? And what would be the barriers to this?
Well, I'm certain that the commercial providers that are supporting things like Bank ID around the Nordics are definitely hoping it can be exported to other territories. And I'm aware of a number of areas that they're getting involved in other countries of larger size around Europe and around the world. I think the key things are looking at exporting the Nordic model. You're looking for all the success factors that Krista and Christopher have talked about. And I think one of the key things is the trust factor. So when you're moving into a new territory, looking at exporting something like Bank ID, perhaps into a new country, it's the trust between the banks, it's the collaboration. I think in some other banking industries, there is we collaborate where we must and compete where we can, as opposed to what Christopher was saying, which is where we collaborate where we can and compete where we must. I think that's a very clear and one of the impediments to getting this done. And certainly, I completely agree with Christopher that there are some cultural and habitual requirements that need to be fulfilled. I mean, I guess one of the challenges is that underlying this, we require quite a lot of infrastructure from government. So we require identity registration, we require close collaboration between the government and the banking industry to be able to go and put these sorts of schemes in place. And some of those projects have been successful and some of those projects have been unsuccessful. Occasionally you get governments which are less successful at talking to the banking industry. And I'm thinking about, for example, a short-lived project called Gaia in the UK back in 2011, where that sort of dialogue was being encouraged, but unfortunately it died a death because there was ostensibly no lack of agreement around liability, which is fundamental to the financial services industry, but the government, obviously that's less important to them. So I think when we're looking at the success in exporting the Nordic model, we're looking at being able to sign people up. We're looking at the availability of services that they can use. Because taking on Krista's point, if we're using these services once a year to file our tax, then it's likely we'll have forgotten how to log in, or we'll have may not be using these sort of identity services that often. Whereas if we're using them every week, then that sort of identity service, being able to prove who we are when we log into our bank, when we log into other providers, that sort of service becomes part of our daily life. And it's an important part of our daily life as well. And I think that's the challenge. We need to make sure that those other services are available. And other countries are different places in their journey towards digitalization of government services as well. So there's an interesting dynamic. If I were one of those providers looking at countries to move into, you'd be looking for those countries which have adopted a more digital government approach. But I mean, so I think there are a number of things that I think it's definitely possible to go and export this. I think the challenge is finding out the lowest hanging fruit of the countries which are more likely to adopt it. And it's those which are more technically savvy, as we've heard, with a better trust framework between the banks and government, and having a real adoption of of sort of technology and technology-based services on which these sorts of identity services can be based?
Well, there are efforts attempting to export this out of the Norwegian market, but I agree with everything you say, Jonathan. I think it's extremely difficult to export this out from one country to another. Banking as a whole is a multinational play. There's so many differences. There's trust factors. Look at the US market, for instance, or Germany, where you don't have a national identity register. So there's one fundamental piece of the puzzle that's missing that makes it completely impossible. If I were to place my bets, I would place my bets rather on big tech than banks to dominate digital identity looking 5 to 10 years in the future, but we'll get back to that.
Yes, no, absolutely, we will come to that. Just wanted to take a quick look actually at the US. You mentioned briefly the US, and Melissa, I'm wondering, what's happening in the US? How are financial institutions working with national governments on identity there, if at all? And what's it looking like in the US region?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. It's my pleasure to be here today and talk about the US. So I'll start a little bit with the role that the government plays. So in general, the government is more of a standards and guidelines provider. They don't mandate to us in the US what we must do, and they certainly don't provide digital identity infrastructure. So for instance, we have the FFIEC, which is the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, which provides guidelines to banks on how they should authenticate and verify customers in the digital space. We also have standards given to us by the National Institute for Technology, and that's NIST. And I'll also say, by the way, that in the US, we love acronyms for very long names. You'll hear me say that a couple times. But anyway, so, these are standards, not mandates. The government examines us against these standards, but they really don't do anything other than take actions against us and ensure that we're doing a good job relative to these standards. I will say also, though, in recent years, we have seen the government come out with the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, or NSTIC, which is another acronym for a very long name. But this is government funded, and they are attempting to put forward a strategy in digital identity. However, again, it's a vision and a strategy. So here they'll give some funding to companies who are piloting different types of online credentials that could be used to prove your identity across multiple systems. But it's not really much of a collaboration, I would say. So in general, what we're seeing is more of a market-driven approach. And we're seeing several attempts in the industry to collaborate. So banks, are certainly trying to collaborate with the early warning venture, which is where banks are putting forth fraud prevention and identity solutions. They've been pretty successful with the Zelle platform, which is a payments platform. The thing is, they're the relying party. So that's one of the reasons why they've been pretty successful. They are trying to put out a sign in with your bank type of option, but it's not one ID. So if you go to a relying party, you would pick which one of your banks you would want to use to sign in with. Then we have the mobile network operators who are trying to join together and use their digital identities to create authentication identity solutions. The issue there is they don't have a bunch of relying parties in waiting, and they also don't have fully verified identities. So there's a lot of customers who have not provided a verified identity to their mobile network operator, and they'll need to verify those customers, and this could prove to be difficult for them. Then we have MasterCard, who is attempting to partner with our banks to get the advantage of those digital identities. They certainly have a number of relying parties in the merchant network, but there is a question as whether the banks will want to join up with MasterCard in something like this. So it'll be interesting to see what wins out. We've already talked a lot about how we don't have a national identity infrastructure. So I think who will win out will be who can get to scale with verified identities and relying parties, which should be interesting to see what happens in the US here.
Great. And again, this is a very global panel. We want to look at lots of different regions and how different identity models are working in different areas, and many are pointing to Asia as the future of identity. So just want to ask the panel, will that mode dominate globally, do you think, or is that something that's very much going to stay within its region? You know, will we see the likes of India Stack, WeChat broadening out to a global reach? Do you think? Jonathan, perhaps if we start with you for this question. Oh, sorry, Krista,
Whichever way you want.
Go ahead.
Okay, maybe I'll just briefly say a few words about. Okay, briefly a few words about the means of identification through smartphones and biometrics, which is very prominent in Asia, especially in China. And the reason why it's quite a current topic with us, we have been testing face payment, which is basically facial recognition combined with authentication of the payment. So we're piloting that at the moment here in Finland. Very small pilot, small purchases only in cafes, certain cafes, 5 cities, nothing of scale of yet. But there are several issues that we have tried to tackle with this piloting, especially related to biometric identification and privacy. Because it's clear that whenever we talk about shared identity, which uses biometric, whether it's facial recognition or fingerprint or voice recognition, this issue of privacy and cybersecurity comes very strongly into this discussion. And I think that's one thing that at least we have found, that in a society where there's high trust amongst the different actors, it's still a question that we take, I think, very, very seriously. And I'm not sure whether the certain cultures in Europe are ready to do that in a scale that it is in use in China, for instance, at the moment. But this is just, these are the early results of our pilot. But it's just interesting because China and some of the technologies that they use there have been the benchmark for us for that. And it's curious to see what the end result of this pilot will be. So just one aspect, the biometrics in identification.
Absolutely. Was that similar to what you were going to say there, Jonathan? Or?
Not at all. That's not at all.
Well,
coming back on Krista's point, I think the key thing is that when we're looking at mobile phones, one of the things that isn't widely understood is that in Asia, 79% of mobile phones are on prepaid rather than on contract. And therefore, in most cases, the mobile network operator doesn't really know who their customer is. And so lots of countries across Asia have brought in rules to go and register the owner of their accounts. As Melissa was saying, that doesn't happen in the States. The mobile network operator doesn't like it, doesn't do it, and the customers probably wouldn't like to be registered according to the prepaid phone they've just obtained. But in fact, in Asia, India, China, and Myanmar, amongst others, have actually now moved to a mandatory biometric registration for the mobile network operator. So in China, for example, if you're signing up for a prepaid mobile phone, or in fact any mobile phone, they're going to capture a biometric face image of you so that they can recognize you if necessary in the future, be able to go and track you back. It's more evidence to tie you to that mobile phone number at some point in the future. And that's quite an interesting authentication side, an authentication factor, which might at some point become a factor in used in financial services transactions in addition to everything else. I think one of the key things we're looking at when we look at things like Aadhaar is that it's obviously a government initiative, and it's been running for quite a long while now, and it's been comparatively successful. So 1.25 billion people signed up as of last December. And in fact, the majority that aren't signed up actually would like to sign up and are trying to find out how to go and do that. And Aadhaar relies on biometrics, amongst other things, but in addition, giving a unique identifier to everyone in India, being able to make sure that they have a unique identifier. And I guess that's part of the fundamental thing that we're trying to track down when we talk about identity. There are two problems. One is, can I identify who this person is? Can I separate them from anyone else? Is there a unique way I can refer to them? And the second side is when they come back, when they log back into my payments, my banking application, how do I really know it's them? It's an authentication problem. So there's an identity proofing problem and there's an authentication problem. And we need both parts of that to be able to succeed. With Aadhaar, you have both of those two things coming together. You have the unique identifier, but also the biometric registration. And it's been very successful in making lots of payments, especially benefit payments, to Indian nationals who registered on the Aadhaar system. So tremendously successful, but again, fairly unique as a government initiative in which they've invested a huge amount of resource, given that they didn't have much in the way of registration beforehand. China, where we're looking at a different challenge they've got, they're looking at obviously registration of IDs, using it of users on WeChat, but the national identity card has been a very successful project. So they're starting off from a different place. So when we look at Asia, it's a different set of challenges each country has. I remember reading some research on the Philippines and Malaysia recently, and they look at online proofing of customers for financial services contracts. And as part of that, they're onboarding customers with their images of their face and their documents as well, and doing some of that online. And quite surprisingly, they're quite, unsurprisingly, I guess, maybe for those people who know Asia, they are quite a long way down the lines of electronifying and digitalizing this part of the process to make it easy for people to sign up. In fact, in some cases, ahead of USA and Europe as well. So there are lots of things which are happening. So there are a number of things that are happening across Asia. Is there one model we could say, this is the Asian model, we're going to take it and we're going to apply it to, say, Africa or the USA or South America? I don't think there's enough commonality. There's certainly a real will to go and adopt technology and apply it to these challenges, and a governmental will to invest in that. I think that those are the key things which we'll see whether a similar approach works elsewhere around the world.
No, absolutely agree. It's not necessarily one Asia approach to identity then. It's very much different regional differences within the region. And Christopher, do you think there's anything in the Asian model or in any of the different approaches from countries within Asia that will be exported elsewhere, or do you think that that's something that will stay within the region?
It's easy to agree with Jonathan that there's no Asian model. I used to live in Singapore and I've traveled a lot in the region, and there's no one Asia. There's vast differences between Indonesia, South Korea, China, even mainland China, Hong Kong are culturally a bit different. So viewing Asia as one region, I think that is a fallacy when it comes to the cultural differences, and the cultural differences between Asia and Europe. They are huge. Of course, but I think Asia is really on the early adopter side of something that's inevitable, and that's the use of the technology. And biometrics, depending again on where you go in Europe, there are skepticism around biometrics, even in the Nordics, where there are high levels of trust, and there also is a natural curiosity when it comes to technology. People are a bit afraid when technology really comes close to themselves. Whether you talk physical biometrics or you talk behavioral biometrics, it will be a part of our lives, whether we want it or not at some point. So, like in the great words of Gene Roddenberry, resistance is futile when it comes to biometrics. But what kind of biometrics is used in what sense? I think that's also important to really dissect identity. Identity in terms of authentication, in terms of registration, in terms of verification, a profile which not only verifies who you are, but also what your preferences is an extended version of identity. You could take it all the way, like you have done with the social scoring you see in China, which also gives you a social score on how you behave. So there's no one single answer, and it all boils down to really how important this subject area is to understand, not only for banks, but for everybody who wants to have some kind of digital presence, which is based on more than a broadcast model. And as companies are going increasingly truly digital and delivering true digital services, not only digitized brick and mortar services, identity is the key cornerstone of making that happen. In order to really meaningfully transact with your users and customers, you need to know who they are, what they like, and how you should do a secure transaction with them.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of mention of biometrics across Asia being used a lot. What about in the US, Melissa? Has there been much uptake for biometrics there, and is there a lot of acceptance around that, or perhaps some privacy concerns?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that we as financial institutions are looking at now. I do think it's going to be difficult to get adoption. You know, obviously people use their biometrics on their smartphones, but they're pretty aware that those are locally stored. So I do think it's going to be difficult, certainly for the government, to get any sort of adoption of biometric collection, because I think people will have a lack of trust there. And then there'll need to be a very compelling reason on the third party side. And then I think the other barrier we'll face as far as some of these Asian models are really around giving your ID, right? So in the US, we have state issued IDs, or we have passports, which are national issued IDs. I think consumers are going to be very reluctant to give their ID to a third party when it's not for the purposes of extending credit or opening a financial product. We'll see what happens, but I think there's going to be a lot of reluctance in giving that information out freely.
And now it came up before in the conversation. So the question is, how do we think big tech is playing a role globally in terms of identity? Jonathan, perhaps if I start with you, what do you think? Do you think big tech is going to be the way to go for identity, or?
So I think it's a good question, and had you asked this question 3 or 4 years ago, I think a lot of people might have said, yes, we're going to be logging into our banks with our Facebook IDs, but these days I don't hear as many of those people saying that particular thing. I think the challenge is that we're not going to have a single global identity anytime soon, and so the challenge is, how do we then glue all of those separate identities systems together in a sort of what used to be called federated model. I guess it's a risk management thing. So when we're looking at onboarding customers in a new country, what are the things that we need to be thinking about? How can we onboard them in the same sort of way? What are the authentication factors we use in this new country? And that could be fundamentally dependent upon the capabilities of their mobile phones. It could be dependent upon cultural things. It could be dependent upon lots of different things. So I think that big tech has a role to play in facilitating the confidence in identity. I think the challenge is matching that to the needs of the financial services businesses that have them. So when we're looking at the onboarding process, we need to be doing strong identity proofing. We need to be making sure that the individual is who they claim to be. We've got supporting identity documents. We have appropriate ways of enrolling them. And when we're talking about authentication as well, I mean, my personal belief is that in 3 or 4 years' time, we'll probably each have 5 or 6 different ways of authenticating ourselves to our financial services organization, mostly because we'll have learned, and the banks will have learned, that not everything works everywhere. So if, for example, my phone has no cell reception, then I'm not going to be able to go and do anything related to a challenge which requires that. So I can't use that. What else can I use to go and authentify myself when I'm actually in a merchant trying to make a transaction? So I think that we're going to learn that multiple authentication methods is going to be the way forward. And this was brought home to me by the ex-CEO of BACS in the UK, the operative a clearinghouse. He's now moved on, but he's a great proponent of electronic payments, trying to make a contactless payment in a retailer, and couldn't use his facial scan because he was wearing a mask. It wouldn't have recognized him. Couldn't use tap his password in because he was being asked to wear gloves in this particular retailer. And so he was thinking, well, how can I transact? And I think we're going to learn a lot of those particular lessons actually with rolling out these different authentication technologies, that no 1, 2, or 3 authentication technologies are going to be sufficient. We're going to have to rely on multiple ones. So I think that when we're looking at big tech, the question to ask them is, okay, I have a transaction. It's this level of risk. What's the appropriate way of ensuring that the individual I'm dealing with is the person they claim to be, is the customer who I've got? And I think that is a much more complicated and nuanced question than simply saying, well, can you check that their fingerprint appears to be the same, or their iris scan, or their password is the same? I think it's a much more complicated question, and I think that will be an interesting challenge for big tech. I don't think it's going to be a big data play for them.
Great. And coming back to the Nordics, Krista, have you seen big tech making, progress in the Nordics? Is that going to be something that's going to be really involved in identity in the Nordic region, or what are your thoughts on that, Krista?
I think obviously we collaborate with the big tech as it is at the moment because of payment services, for instance, Apple Pay and Google Pay. And I think it's pretty clear for banks that the companies are doing what they do best. They are superb in their customer experience design and how smooth they can make a transaction. And I think that is the layer that they work on. And obviously the key driver for the big tech is the data, not really I don't think that big tech wants to be in banking. But they are interested in the data that is involved, obviously, and that's why we collaborate when there's a customer need. In terms of identification, I think one of the reasons, obviously, why I feel at least that the big tech probably does not want to go into full-on licensed banking type of business is that the regulation is very heavy. And if we look at our KYC, our Know Your Customer regulation and anti-fraud, anti-money laundering schemes, it's clear that that kind of identification requires something stronger than, like Jonathan was very well pointing out, an individual means of identification, whether that's facial recognition or fingerprint or password or security question or what have you. So I think that is another element to what probably sets the limits to what big techs want in this sphere. And I think it's a really interesting question of also of trust. We do understand that everyone who is within this network will be somehow having an access to our identification data and our behavioral data. So who are the players that we want to be giving that to? I think that is one of the very, very main questions in that. But yeah, we definitely collaborate with the big tech at the moment already. And I'm sure, even if we're not very big markets, I think the data is still interesting to them.
Great. And Christopher, anything that you would add to that from your perspective?
No, I would like to rewind back to more the broader picture of the big tech, because digital identity, it's you can see it unfolding in front of us. It's an arms race between the big platforms. Sign in with Apple, sign in with Facebook, sign in with Google. And if we rewind a couple of years where the narrative was winner takes it all at every conference, yeah, everybody was scared shitless that Facebook would dominate this space because they had a great momentum. That was before all the scandals hit Facebook and people really started thinking about signing up with Facebook. Well, I think everybody here has signed up with Facebook at some service at least, or Google has some other services, and then Apple has some other services, and then you have bank ID for your bank because, let's be honest, the sign-in with whatever service do not qualify as a bank level authentication in order to comply with the regulatory standards. So we are using a wide array of identification services depending on the service that we use. And even the least tech savvy among us, I think, are starting to have some sense and feel of what kind of security level that you are using deep down below without acknowledging it yourselves. The problem then is that you're scattering your identity solutions all over the place. You see that Chrome is attempting to take a role on sorting out all your passwords within the web browser. There's a whole movement around self-sovereign digital identity, that we ourselves should own our digital identity. I think the decentralized digital identity is a wrong track to go ahead, because you really do not take into account that the weak link of that chain is we as humans, because if we own it ourselves and we forget the password, who do we call? Well, there's nobody to call. It's our own fault. So some kind of identity custodian could be a path towards the future. And looking back at the trust factor, that could be the banks, because you have a trust in the banks. You used to put your valuables in the vault of a bank. So why should not banks be able to? Because banks, they have a need to renew themselves. And I've been in banking now for 7 or 8 years. What is the core business model of banks? Of course, we make money out of interest margins, but one of the core business areas of the banks is trust. It's the trust that enables us to get deposits from our customers. It's the trust that enables banks to then magically convert those deposits into way more money in loans to the customers. And why should not banks leverage that trust into providing identity as a service to a larger extent than they do today? And I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. But that's one scenario for the future that I'm going to be following closely, at least.
Great. Jonathan, I noticed you lit up a little when Christopher mentioned decentralized models of identity. What are your thoughts about that? Is that something that we're going to see going forward, or do you agree that that's not?
So I think the whole idea of decentralized or self-sovereign identity is interesting. I think I would be interested to see how it develops over the next 3 or 4 years. I think there are some good propositions out there, handing an individual the ability to control what they disclose to other individuals by owning the identity proofs and the information and the attributes they have is a great amount of power to hand to them. I think the challenge is, are they ready for that? And that's the thing I don't know. From a financial services side, I guess what we're looking for is where are they going to get recommendations and guidance from? Well, in terms of digital identity, it's probably from the organizations like FATF, the organization which establishes recommendations to fight financial crime and terrorist funding. And so they published earlier on this year some guidance on use of digital identity. And unsurprisingly, it's guidance primarily for governments, for financial services organizations, and for regulators. So not really allowing in the self-sovereign ID players. That's not really the people they speak to. But it was made an interesting point, which was that actually a lot of this digital identity piece is lower risk than the sort of paper-based, face-to-face identity verification processes and identity authentication that we do at the moment. And so they can see some benefits in actually moving to a more digital process. So I think that maybe if we can make self-sovereign ID work and people taking up a digital process, then maybe that is the route that will get people to go and use digital identities as part of financial services even more than they currently do. But it's very much on how it gets delivered and how successful they are and how many players there are out there. And there are quite a few at the moment.
Yes. Remains to be seen, I think. Before we move on to what is actually our final question, as I'm conscious we're almost out of time, I just wanted to ask Melissa. Krista mentioned a lot about the regulation, and I'm sure this is something that you'll be well aware of, going into regulation that goes into KYC and that sort of processes, anti-money laundering, all of that for a bank. Is that something that you think big tech will ever be able to be a player in and providing that identity, or do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. Here in the U.S., obviously we see the same trends that big tech would like to sign you in. Sign in with Google, sign in with Facebook, all the same things. The issue there is they don't have verified identities. And I think it's going to be difficult for them to gain consumer trust, to have access to their verified identities and access to their financial accounts. Now, that said, Apple is the one that I'm watching closely here in the US. Apple is, we US consumers love our Apple products and we're very entrenched. So if a digital driver's license does take hold in the US, we can see a situation where Apple could have folks adding that digital driver's license to their mobile phone and instantly have just a ton of verified identities. And, I think Krista had mentioned earlier how they create, great customer experiences. So if they're able to put together those ton of verified identities with great customer experiences, you could see a lot of adoption for Apple in this space. And so that will be interesting. I think the regulation piece, they'll have to deal with that aspect then. And what could be very interesting also for banks is it could be a game changer as far as our ability to, control customer experience, our ability to do that risk evaluation that, Krista was talking about earlier, which we're good at because we would be disaggregated from, from that data and information. And then, of course, there could be a financial impact. Apple may want to charge us to, to verify identities, which is, something we're certainly fearful of. So those are things we're watching in the US from a big tech perspective.
Now, as I say, unfortunately, we are almost out of time, but I would just like to ask one final question to everybody. We've touched on this a little through some of the discussions that have come up, and we've looked at a lot of different regions and different regions' approaches to identity. But how do you think culture and politics are going to impact identity innovation and progress going forward? If we start with Krista, what do you think?
Wow, it's a big question to save for last, I think.
Yes.
Because clearly cultural and political aspects has a great impact on how we see digital identity. What do we think it should include? Who should have it? Who should we give it to? How can we use it? How do we want to use it? I think there are so many aspects to digital identity when you do the kind of strong digital identity like we see from a banking point of view. And it's definitely a cultural thing as well, because like we were talking earlier about the Nordics, for instance, yes, there is a technical infrastructure and a certain aspects of that kind, but the key elements are in the sort of national DNA of many of the Nordic countries and how we perceive the society and individuals as a whole. So that's probably the sort of more philosophical aspects of the question.
Yeah.
Then as to the sort of practical things, I think from a practical point of view, obviously politics in terms of regulation, for instance, has a great part to play. And if we look at, for instance, the differences in how we deal with privacy and how we see a government's role in individuals' lives. Those are the kind of things that come from legislation and regulation, and everyone who is utilizing the digital identity, whether they're financial institutions or authorities or the citizens using them, they all have to comply with those rules. So I think it's a massive question, and I'm sure that there is this kind of fundamental questions that you need to ask, and then the practical, local and local political and cultural aspects as well. So I'm looking forward to hearing my co-panelists to bring their view on.
Yeah, fantastic answer. Jonathan, what do you think? Would you agree?
So I think there are two key things. I think Chris has picked up two the very important points. For me, politics has to go and deliver the underlying building blocks, as we've talked about earlier, having proper registration of individuals, having unique register, either a birth register or some other means, is essential. And I think that the politics needs to deliver those for countries which don't already have them. And some countries don't, and surprisingly, some countries which are meant to be developed don't have such a reliable measure. So I think the politics has a lot of work to do getting the ground rules sorted out. But I think there's also work to do on starting to evolve the culture. There are countries out there that have aversion to looking at things like identity cards and don't really understand how those work. So I think that there's cultural work as well. Only when we bring those two things together will we actually have citizens who feel a need to go use the services which are supported by things like digital identity, and then enable the individual to go and transact remotely, as we're finding necessary over the last 6 or 7 months or so. So I think what we need to understand is, as citizens, is why identity is important, and politicians need to help educate us. I think that's the most important. If they don't, they won't gain traction from the voters for the projects which we need to go and build, or building a system like maybe Aadhaar in some countries, building other sorts of EIDAS compliant systems elsewhere. But I think one of the key things is that when we're looking at this, we have to look at all of the operational processes as well, when it actually gets to the rubber hitting the road, as it said. When actually we are using it as financial services customers, we need to make sure the operational processes where we're using our identities are effective and we trust them. If we don't get that, we can do all the technology work in the world, we can do all the cultural work and political work in the world, we just won't get usage.
Absolutely. Christopher, what are your thoughts? Is culture impacting identity innovation and progress, or do you think it's sort of natural that different regions will have different approaches to identity?
Well, I gotta say, there's a lot of great stuff already being said here. I just want to double down on. I just want to double down on the topic that's been touched upon several times today. A culture for collaboration. I think that's a key ingredient. Like Jonathan exemplified the opposite of the Nordic model, where you collaborate where you must. If that's the political and cultural climate within the industry, I think it's extremely important to really get anywhere when it comes to digital identity, because a successful digital identity scheme needs to be widespread across various players within the industry and also outside of the industry. And if there's not a climate that's suitable to make that happen, I think you are looking at an uphill battle, which I don't want even my worst enemy to start running.
Finally, Melissa, as Christopher says, there's been a lot of great things said already, but any final thoughts on this question of culture and politics?
Yeah, I think in the U.S. it's privacy and trust are going to be the key aspects. So who are consumers trust with their information? What are the privacy aspects? What are they going to be willing to share? The big culture player in the U.S. is customer experience. So if someone can create that compelling customer experience where customers are willing to trust and go through hurdles that take into account their privacy concerns, I think customers will adopt it. So that's going to be the interesting thing to watch here. And I think the other piece is going to be that we'll continue to look towards market-driven approaches. So we're not going to be, having our government mandate anything. The government's probably not going to supply a bunch of infrastructure. So we're going to tend to see a lot of market-driven approaches and expect that to solve our problem in the digital identity space, which is going to have its challenges, I think, like we've discussed in this call.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, I think we could talk about this for hours, but unfortunately, we are out of time. So I would like to thank all of the panelists, Melissa, thank you, Jonathan, Krista, and Christopher as well for joining us today. It's a fantastic discussion and really interesting to hear all of your thoughts from a really global perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. If everyone would like to remain on the main stage, then we've next got coming up our showcase discussion, The Journey to P27. So stay here for that, and thank you very much once again, everyone, for joining.